What's up, everybody? It's your favorite viewer, upsetter's favorite nerd, and today we are looking at our list. This always rubs people the wrong way. Don't take it too personal, buddies. It's just my opinion on the stuff that I looked at this year. This is our Transformers list. This means all of the Transformers that I have looked at this year. Some I purchased, most I didn't. We break them down to a number of categories. The first category being most disappointing. Just a reminder, this doesn't mean that it was a bad figure. It just means that I had an expectation, and this figure fell short of my expectation. And we'll start with number 5, which is a non-transforming piece, the 3-0 MDLX Optimus Prime. And the reason being, this figure isn't awful. In fact, it's far from it. It's solid. It's fine. It's very average. But it makes this list, albeit low on the list, it makes this list because the Bumblebee was so impressive to me. It was so surprisingly good, you might say. It felt like an SH Figuarts in hand. It felt like a Figma, or even Mafex these days. Whereas this one felt a little bit clumsier, a little bit used to the problems that I've experienced with their larger stuff. And as a result, while it's a decent figure, it was disappointing. Number 4, Fans Toys Jive. And the reason why this is disappointing for me is because paint has always been a big deal for me. And Fans Toys became quickly one of my favorite companies because of the paint detail that they gave their figures. Now, through the years, along with transformations and stuff, there's always been some paint rub here and there, but in my opinion, it's been so minimal. However, there's no reason for the paint rub that I got on this figure. It's just from wear and tear of actually manipulating the figure during a transformation, which was extremely disappointing for me. That, along with the fact that one thing that Fans Toys has been consistently improving upon this year, I would argue the only thing they've been improving upon, is their transformations. They've gone from being nightmares to being enjoyable fun times. And this was a return to form of nightmare status. River Bottom Nightmare Band. And as a result, while there's plenty to like about this figure, it left me disappointed. Number 3, Alien Attack Macrotron, or Macrotron, whatever his name was. Look, I didn't necessarily have high expectations of this figure, so it's not really that. I remember the first Alien Attack release that I looked at. It was like the red thing, Dino maybe, whatever that was. And it was awful. Materials felt cheesy and cheap. There was no paint on it, blah, 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 right? So I opened up this thing and took a brief look at it, and I was like, holy mackerel. Well, they fixed it. The materials feel good. It's painted head to toe. In fact, the paint is shockingly good. Maybe they got it all right. And then I went to transform it, and they got one thing super wrong. One of the worst transformations of my 9-year tenure in this business, not soon to be forgotten, and as a result, it left me disappointed. Number 2, Iron Factory Lockdown. I love Iron Factory. I've always had a soft spot for them. I enjoy their takes. I enjoy their imagination. I enjoy their creativity. And I was looking forward to even trying a new line with them, being the Samurai line. But this is the first thing from them that I ever got that's just kind of felt like a piece of junk. I've had good Iron Factory toys, amazing ones, bad ones, and fair ones, but never one that felt like a complete piece of junk until this one. Very disappointing release. My number 1 most disappointing figure for the year is X-Transbots Jansen, for a number of reasons. One, I felt like X-Transbots has really been on a roll recently. Yeah, they kind of screwed the pooch with their Minosaur, but all of the Stunticons individually were good. Surprisingly good, you might say. Then we had their Protectobots, and the transformation of Streetwise was kind of a bear, but it definitely had its good elements as well. And then Groove was kind of an amazing release for me. And then all of a sudden, this thing came out, and with this was a whole bunch of hype around it. A whole bunch of people saying like, wow, it's so great. And then I got a hold of it and I was like, where? And not that I think it's bad, but those leg clips broke on me. There were stability issues in terms of the structural integrity of the figure. And I wasn't the only one those leg things broke on, by the way. Just for all the hype mixed with a few releases prior to that were very consistent and good, this one left me extremely disappointed. And there they are. And I mean, I didn't buy many of them. I didn't buy many Transformers this year in general. But it's not that I think that any of these figures are particularly terrible except the Lockdown. They just all seem a step short of their expectations that their previous releases or reputations have set for me. And that's why they're here. Now, moving on to the surprisingly good figures of the year. Once again, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're great. However, in this example, it does. But what it does mean is that I had an expectation and the figure surpassed my expectation. This is the exact inverse of their prime. I had very low expectations for this piece because I think 3-0 is good, but I don't think 3-0 feels very polished, like in their joint tolerances and a lot of stuff like that. But this thing felt smooth as butter. One of the kind of best action figures I've looked at in a long time in general. If this was in the non-Transformers list, it'd be the top of a couple of lists probably. It's just a really, really, really well done figure from a company that I think always sculpts things well and paints things well. There's just like the build and assembly isn't always as tight as it could be, but this one is. It's money in the bank. A shorty what you drink. So I'm happy to say it's made the list for most surprisingly good figures of the year. Number 4 is Moon Studios Raiden. Now this isn't what you're looking at right now. This is stock footage from the review, but that's because it's far too much of a pain to get that thing down from its spot, and then guns fall off and all sorts of stuff. And let me be very clear. This figure is far from perfect. However, I was expecting it to be a nightmare based on the fact that they weren't using the parts forming technology that they had kind of perfected with their Zeta stuff. And I thought to myself, well, here we go, trying to reinvent the wheel. If it ain't broke, don't try and fix it. But they tried, and while I don't think it's quite as stable as their previous releases, it's nowhere near as flimsy as what I expected it to be. And that's why it makes the list at number 4 for most surprisingly good. Number 3, Iron Factory Grimlock. Having looked at the Lockdown not too far before this one, I was like, well, what exactly is this line gonna be? Is this the Dollar Tree version of the Iron Factory stuff that I'm used to? No, it wasn't. This Grimlock checks every box that I expect Iron Factory to check, with pride, paint, build, articulation, character, dynamic and dramatic sculpting, smart stuff, utilizing the flags, just everything. Everything is so thought out and so cared for. And being as though it came after Lockdown, I was pleasantly surprised. 2. Hasbro Transformers Legacy Motormaster. This isn't an amazing figure. It's nowhere near top 5 figures of the year. I'm not even sure it'd be in the top 25 figures of the year for me in terms of just specifically Transformers. However, due to my expectations of this company, also due to the fact that I've always said, raise the price and give me something decent and you won't hear me complain, I've got to give credit where credit is due, and I was pleasantly surprised with the build quality, sculpt, and engineering of this thing. Especially when I just recently handled their drag strip and was so disappointed in their proportions and things of that nature. When I got this fixed all of those things that I had issues with. It fixed all the issues of things that I had with the previous Motormaster release from Combiner Wars, along with the Minosaur, God forbid. But this thing really does do a better job and left me pleasantly surprised. And my number 1 most surprisingly good figure of the year is also an X-Transbots release, but this time with their Hauler or Inferno mold. If you know me or listen to me in any capacity, I was the one beating the drum the loudest, perhaps saying, look, it's an old design, Takara's already probably locked into most people's hearts. What's the point? Let this thing go, let the past die, etc., etc. What could you possibly have to offer in this super saturated space? And the truth is, they had my favorite of the Inferno molds to date to offer. It's striking, it's articulated, it has an interesting, intimidating, and dynamic aesthetic. It's painted well, and the transformation is good fun. It's a home run to me in every sense of the word, and I didn't expect it at all. And there are my top 5 most surprisingly good figures, and luckily I have 2 of the 5. You know, better than having 5 of the 5 disappointments or 5 of the 5 worst figures of the year, you know what I mean? And actually I have 3 because I have the Raiden, I just don't have it down here. And yeah, I mean, all for different reasons, and with the exception of the Bumblebee and the Inferno mold, none of them really necessarily a home run, just really well done to a point that you wouldn't expect from the company itself or from previous releases within the line. Top 5 surprisingly good figures of 2022. But we can't have the good without the bad, so let's move on to the worst figures of the year. 3-0 makes the list again with their Premium Prime. Now, I know that plenty of people out there had a more positive experience. However, the experience that I had was a figure that came broken, that came misassembled, that had screws stripped, just a number of things that are not only inconsistent with this company's reputation and caliber, but they're also inconsistent with what makes a figure good. Yoda said it the best, look at me, judge me by my size, do you? And while this thing does have a number of things aesthetically going for it, it is, to use another Star Wars reference, the inverse of the Falcon. This particular copy that I looked at didn't have it where it mattered. It didn't have it where it counts, kid. And for that, it makes number 5 worst figures of the year for me. 4, bingo! Toys. Waveman. This to me is an Emperor's New Clothes sort of deal. It's a very average to below average figure masquerading as something important and something elite. But when you really start to look behind the curtain, you get to see who the Wizard of Oz actually is, and what it is a poorly engineered, poorly designed, cheap shell of a figure, in my opinion. Once again, I know it has some things going for it. I completely agree. I think it has some aesthetic cues that are cool. I think some of the thought behind it is cool. I just feel like this one was lying to the consumer base, and that always left a bad taste in my mouth, so to speak. Numero Trace, Magic Square Devastator. It just didn't have the structural stability. There was plenty of things that I liked about the robots, other things I didn't, but it just didn't have the structural stability to pull off the combine mode successfully. And if that fails, then the whole thing it's rendered useless, right? It doesn't work, and if it doesn't work, then it's not good. Now, I prefer it aesthetically over the New Age. It just doesn't have the minerals to stay and work as a thing properly. It's frustrating, that dog chew toy plastic. None of it works to the advantage of the overall presentation, which is a bummer because it looks great, but it just fails in every pragmatic way. And that's why it ends up right average in the list at number 3. Number 2, Trans Arts Mighty Guardian. And I had everybody and their mother tell me that this looked like the model and everything else. Let me tell you something, I don't care. None of that changes that it does look dumb, but I'll even put that aside. But the plastic quality is trash, the build quality was trash, the articulation was suspect. Like, it's just not good. Like, people always try to blame my opinions on this stuff on my feelings about a line or whatever. I don't like Beast Wars. I've been very honest and upfront about that, but I've loved a lot of Beast Wars figures. I've loved a number of the Takara Tomy masterpieces. I love the Generation Toys efforts. I've also loved Armada figures and Prime figures and all sorts of figures of stuff that I'm not necessarily really interested in. To include Bayverse stuff. It doesn't really impact my opinion when it comes to stuff like this. It impacts my preference as to whether or not I'm gonna buy it, but it doesn't really impact my opinion. And my opinion on this is crystal clear. This is trash. I mean, my 6-year-old gets better quality toys than this at a fraction of the price. Just awful. And my number 1 choice for worst figure of the year, I hate to say it because it was loaned to me by a very, very, very nice guy, but it's this MBK King of the Snipers. Not only did it break on me, it's one of the worst looking robots I've ever seen in history. It doesn't really work as a Transformer in any real meaningful way. It certainly doesn't work as an action figure. This is where a lot of people confuse engineering because they only associate engineering with transformation. This thing does the transformation well enough. I mean, it broke, but aside from that, but it fails the engineering of an action figure. It just doesn't work. The sniper rifle is super cool. It is what it has going for it, but it just fails in every other capacity, and as a result, it makes number 1. And there they are, the top 5 worst figures that I looked at. And luckily, this year I dodged the bullet on all of them. I'm sorry if you didn't. Trust me, I bought my fair share of bad figures as well. And you may have not dodged the bullet and like it, which makes it even better for you. But yeah, these were pretty bad for different reasons. And let's end on a high note, shall we? Zeta's Legend Scale Superion. I had an absolute blast with this figure. In fact, it may be the most fun that I had with any Transformer toy that I looked at this year that I didn't buy myself. It has all the playability elements, plus it transforms in a fun way, plus the combine mode is stable. It's like the exact opposite of the Magic Square. It's sculpted well, it's proportioned well, like they just nail it. They nail it with parts forming, but they've got it down to a science. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. A very, very, very well done Legend Scale set piece. Coming in at number 4, Fans Toys Rig. A really solid offering. There are limitations here. There's articulation issues, but I kind of expect that with this company for the most part. I'm almost surprised when it's anything different. I also don't prefer the shoulders to be down on the cartoon model. I prefer the more heroic shoulders. It's kind of what I've always liked about it. This is a different conversation for a different day. The reason why this makes the list is because, with the exception of that one little shoulder spot, it is sculpted well, and even though I don't like that shoulder spot, I get what they were trying to do, and they did it well. It's painted beautifully, and the transformation is effortless, smart, intuitive, and kind of has masterpiece moments along the way, something that Fans Toys isn't really known for. It's not the most flashy figure, it's just a figure that checks a lot of boxes all the way down, and that's why it made the list. Number 3 is New Age David. I think they nailed this. I hate the term mini masterpiece. I don't think that things need to be a mini masterpiece. It could just be a mini great figure. But if there was ever a figure in the history of Transformers that I thought was a mini masterpiece, it's this one. It just feels like something that's more than what it actually is. And I don't know how else to describe that, but they bottled the character somehow and really made it work. It's not my favorite aesthetic for a Prime. It's way too skinny and way too tuned and stuff like that. But it doesn't mean that I don't understand exactly what they were going for and acknowledge that they not only pulled it off, they knocked it out of the park. I can't think of a better example of a more definitive Prime in this scale. Number 2, New Age Jetfire. Once again, I feel like I'm using the terminology I hate. I don't feel like this is a mini masterpiece. I feel like this is a fantastic Legends figure. But that being said, I don't know if it's the size or what, and I've said it before, but it's the first time that I pulled a Legends class figure out of the box, and it immediately felt to me like, Bobby, sit down, take a minute. Do not treat this like a normal Legends figure. This is beyond what you are used to within this scale. And my instincts were right, because it was. And the transformation was one of my favorites of the year. Like, it just continued to impressed me throughout the entire experience. A lot of this stuff, because I don't buy a lot of these figures, a lot of this stuff comes down to my experience with it, my 2 to 4 hour experience with something. And when my experience is overwhelmingly positive and I have no intention of buying it, I just love and appreciate it for what it is. I know it's something great, and this is an example of that. And what I consider to be the best figure of the year, it's MMC DZEF. In terms of Transformers, I can't think of a figure that does everything it's supposed to do better than this one. It's trying to get the IDW aesthetic, it knocks it out of the park. It's trying to fit within the reformatted line, scale-wise, it knocks it out of the park. It has the same sort of plastics that we're used to and tolerances within the joints and transformation components that we're used to. With reformatted, it knocks it out of the park. It has paint, in fact, more paint than we're used to with reformatted, once again, knocks it out of the park. It implements things that we've always liked to have seen, like die-cast and stuff within the reformatted line, so that it improves upon the line, which is another thing that I take into consideration with figure of the year, and I just can't think of a better example. Plus, it's named after my friend, and that means a lot to me also. But even that withstanding, that's not why it made the list. It just helps me feel better about picking something that I didn't buy. And not that reformatted is 100% over, but I do expect that it will slow down significantly, and if this is kind of the last statement piece from the line, I can't think of a better release to do it with. Like, it's absolutely perfect in what it's trying to do. And once again, there they are. I didn't buy many, you know, I only bought one, but that doesn't mean that I don't recognize that the others were great. You know, it was definitely the year of the legend. It's quickly turning into the decade of the legend, which is fine. It's just kind of doesn't do much for my interest. I think Masterpiece has in many ways lost its way. It certainly has lost its voice. And I think that becomes more and more clear with each year that goes by. But that being said, it doesn't mean there weren't good offerings, just not many that I bought. I bought a lot of like fair to pretty good to in this case with Rig, great options. Top 5 Transformer figures of the year in my book. And there they are, with the exception of Raiden, of the figures that I bought that made the list this year. Now, I was gifted a few here and there. I was gifted this Bumblebee. But in terms of figures that really made an impact to me, I mean, there's plenty that I bought that didn't make the list, you know? Because I just don't think they compete in the same way. I don't think they're as good as some of the Legends ones that I looked at or whatever. You know, I'm trying to be as objective as possible about it. But so it was a weird year, man. It was a weird year for Transformers if you think about it. Like, MMC didn't really put out much. X-Transbots didn't really put out much. You know, they kind of swung for the fences at the fourth quarter with Commander Stack and the Inferno mold and all that, but like, it was a quiet year for them. Like, Fanstores was the only real consistent company in the Masterpiece line. So for a guy like me, in terms of my collection interests, it was a very, very strange year indeed. But we've seen it coming, right? So it shouldn't come as any surprise. Doesn't mean there weren't great releases, and a lot of people collect Legends and other kind of, like, you know, movie stuff or novelty stuff, whatever the case may be. So there were definitely some interesting pieces out there this year. Just none for me, you know, with a few exceptions. But yeah, it was a rough one. 2022 was a rough one. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.